Get that poor man out of my VIP seat. People dressed like him belong in economy class, not next to me. The seat is mine. Remove him before we miss departure. Remove him. Men like you don't belong up front. Every passenger in first class was watching when Elijah Carter rose from the seat he had legally purchased. One hand holding his daughter's backpack and the other protecting her trembling fingers. His worn coat, scuffed shoes, and quiet expression had already convinced the crew that he was less important than the wealthy woman now settling comfortably into his place. No one examined the boarding pass she covered beneath her hand. No one questioned why Elijah remained so calm as his name disappeared from the cabin record. As he stepped toward the aircraft door, a small black card briefly slipped from his wallet marked with an emblem the flight attendant almost recognized before it vanished again. Elijah did not protest, threaten, or demand special treatment. He simply studied the crew members' badges and glanced once at the altered passenger screen. Within moments, hurried footsteps approached from the terminal. What devastating mistake had they made by judging this single father too quickly? Elijah Carter entered the first-class cabin of Meridian Atlantic Airlines with one hand resting protectively on the shoulder of his 10-year-old daughter, Zoe. Nothing about him suggested wealth or influence. He was a tall black man in his early 40s with close-cut hair and a quiet, unhurried way of moving. His dark brown wool coat had softened at the elbows after years of use. His pale blue shirt was plain and open at the collar, and the leather on his black shoes was worn along the edges. Zoe followed closely in a cream-knitted sweater, carrying a small navy backpack against her chest. They were traveling to Denver for a memorial service, honoring Zoe's late mother, followed by a school science exhibition the next morning. Elijah had chosen the earliest direct flight so Zoe could arrive rested, and he had legally purchased seats 1A and 1B in first class. When they reached the front row, Elijah checked the boarding passes once more, placed Zoe beside the aisle in 1B, and helped her secure the backpack beneath the seat. He settled into 1A by the window, fastened his seatbelt, and quietly watched the ground crew moving beyond the glass. Zoe opened her sketchbook and began tracing the outline of an airplane wing. For several peaceful minutes, they looked like any father and daughter preparing for a long journey. Then Cassandra Whitmore entered the cabin. Her arrival changed the atmosphere before she spoke a single word. She moved through the aisle in a fitted white designer suit, followed by a nervous assistant carrying an expensive leather case. Several passengers recognized her as the chief executive of Whitmore Global and immediately straightened in their seats. Cassandra barely acknowledged them, her attention fixed on seat 1A. She stopped beside Elijah and looked first at his worn coat, then at his scuffed shoes, before turning toward Diane Fletcher, the senior flight attendant responsible for first-class service. "Why is this man sitting in my seat?" she asked. Diane glanced at Cassandra's boarding pass and saw that it clearly listed another position farther back in the cabin. She also looked at Elijah's pass, which showed 1A without ambiguity. For one brief moment, the truth was obvious. Then Diane noticed the Whitmore Global logo on Cassandra's assistant's documents and remembered the rumors of a valuable corporate travel agreement. And this is where the failure actually began, long before any record was altered. Diane did not lack information. She had the correct information in both hands at the same moment. What she lacked was the willingness to let a document outrank a reputation. Injustice of this kind rarely starts with a lie. It starts with a person deciding which truth is more expensive to admit. Her professional smile tightened. "There may have been a system error," she said, despite knowing there had not been one. Elijah held out his boarding pass. "Zoe and I were assigned these seats when the reservation was confirmed." Cassandra did not take the pass. She looked at Elijah as though his explanation itself were offensive. "People can print anything at home," she said. "I requested the front seat weeks ago." Elijah remained calm. "Your request does not change the ticket I purchased." Zoe stopped drawing and looked up. Diane's expression hardened, not because Elijah had raised his voice, but because he had contradicted a powerful passenger in front of witnesses. She asked him to step into the aisle so the matter could be resolved without delaying boarding. Elijah refused to leave Zoe alone and requested that Diane verify the reservation through the central system. Diane tapped rapidly on her tablet, then angled the screen away from him. Instead of confirming the existing assignment, she announced that the airline needed 1A for an operational accommodation. She offered Elijah a seat in economy near the rear of the aircraft. When he asked about Zoe, Diane said the child could remain in 1B while he sat separately, or both could accept whatever seats became available after boarding ended. Zoe's fingers tightened around the edge of her sketchbook. Elijah's voice stayed even, but his eyes sharpened. You are proposing to separate a 10-year-old child from her only parent because another passenger prefers our seat. Diane lowered her voice and warned him not to make the situation more difficult. Cassandra gave a dismissive laugh and told Diane that a person who truly belonged in first class would understand discretion. Several passengers turned toward them. One man lifted his phone, pretending to check a message while recording. Another passenger whispered to her companion and glanced at Elijah's coat. Zoe noticed every look. Her cheeks flushed, and she lowered her head as though she had done something shameful. Elijah leaned toward her and quietly told her to keep breathing. Diane called Gregory Hale, the terminal manager, claiming an uncooperative passenger was obstructing departure. Gregory arrived within minutes, already irritated by the possibility of a delay. Diane spoke to him, first describing Cassandra as a priority corporate client, and Elijah as a passenger refusing a necessary reassignment. Gregory did not ask Elijah for his version. He did not properly examine the reservation history or confirm whether the proposed separation of father and child violated procedure. Instead, he glanced at Cassandra's jewelry, recognized her name, and made his decision. He told Elijah that airlines reserve the right to change seats for operational needs and offered him a travel voucher of modest value. Elijah asked Gregory to state the operational reason in writing. Gregory refused. He warned that airport security would remove Elijah if he continued resisting crew instructions. Cassandra folded her arms and watched with open satisfaction. "This is taking far too long," she said. "Move him before he ruins the flight for everyone." The passenger's attention became heavier than the silence. Zoe looked up at her father with wet eyes. "Did we do something wrong?" she whispered. Elijah looked at Diane's silver name badge, then at Gregory's identification card. He memorized both names. He studied the tablet in Diane's hand and saw that the seat assignment field had changed, though he had never consented to any modification. That detail mattered more to him than the insult. Without showing anger, he removed his paper boarding pass, folded it slowly and precisely, and placed it on the armrest. Then he stood. Cassandra stepped aside just enough to let him pass, her smile thin and triumphant. "Next time," she said loudly, "buy a ticket that matches your place in the world." A few passengers looked uncomfortable, but no one challenged her. Elijah helped Zoe put on her backpack and took her hand. As they moved into the aisle, Diane informed the cabin that the seating issue had been resolved. Cassandra lowered herself into 1A and rested her hand over Elijah's folded boarding pass without reading the name printed inside. Zoe kept her eyes on the floor while her father led her toward the aircraft door. Elijah did not argue, threaten, or reveal anything about himself. He simply paused beside Diane, looked once at the altered passenger screen, and said that changing a traveler's record without consent was not a seating preference. It was a serious decision. Gregory dismissed the warning and ordered him to keep moving. Elijah obeyed, guiding Zoe away from the cabin while the passengers watched the plainly dressed single father leave the seat he had legally purchased. Behind them, Cassandra settled comfortably against the headrest, convinced that the aircraft had finally been restored to the order she believed wealth entitled her to command. Notice what Elijah did with his boarding pass before he stood up. He did not crumple it or throw it down. He folded it carefully and set it where it could still be found. A person who is only angry destroys the evidence of his humiliation. A person who intends to protect others preserves it. When someone treats you unfairly, the calmest thing you can do is also the strongest. Keep the proof. Keep your voice steady and let your record speak when the room refuses to listen. Elijah and Zoe were not taken back into the terminal. Instead, Gregory Hale instructed a gate employee to keep them inside the jet bridge while the crew searched for 2 available seats in economy. The aircraft door remained open behind them, and the low mechanical hum of the cabin mixed with the sounds of luggage being shifted overhead. Zoe stood close to her father with both hands gripping the straps of her Navy backpack. Her face was still red from humiliation, and she avoided looking through the doorway where Cassandra now occupied the window seat that had belonged to Elijah. A gate employee repeatedly checked a handheld device, then quietly told Gregory that the remaining economy seats were scattered throughout the cabin. Gregory ordered her to keep searching. He seemed more concerned about avoiding another confrontation with Cassandra than about keeping a child beside her father. Elijah remained still near the wall of the jet bridge, watching the employee navigate through different screens. He did not ask for a better seat. He did not demand that Cassandra be removed. His attention stayed on the sequence of changes appearing in the reservation system and on the growing unease in Zoe's expression. After several moments, Zoe finally looked up at him. "Why didn't you tell them who you are?" she asked softly. The question carried no pride or expectation of privilege. It came from a child trying to understand why her father had allowed strangers to embarrass him when she believed he could have stopped them. Elijah lowered himself slightly so they were at eye level. He placed one hand on her shoulder and glanced toward the aircraft door before answering. "Because if they respect us only after learning that I have power, then they never respected us at all." Zoe looked toward the cabin again. "But they made everyone think we were lying." Elijah's expression softened. He told her that truth did not become weaker merely because a room full of people failed to recognize it. What mattered now was not proving that he deserved a particular seat. What mattered was understanding how easily the people responsible for passenger safety had ignored their own rules. "Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. Most of us assume we would have spoken up in that cabin. But the passengers on that aircraft were not villains. They were ordinary people who calculated in about 4 seconds that defending a stranger was more expensive than finishing their coffee. That calculation is the quiet engine behind almost every public injustice. And the uncomfortable truth is that we all run it every day in smaller rooms than this one." Zoe did not fully understand, but she recognized the calm certainty in his voice. She stepped closer and held his hand. Elijah looked down at the boarding information displayed on the gate employee's device. He could see enough to know that his original assignment had not simply been replaced for operational purposes. His name had been removed from Seat 1A, moved into an unassigned economy status, and marked as though he had voluntarily accepted the change. Zoe's seat remained temporarily attached to 1B, creating a record that suggested she would travel separately from him. No one had asked Elijah to sign anything. No one had recorded his refusal. Diane Fletcher had not merely taken his chair. She had altered the official passenger record to make her action appear legitimate. Elijah asked the employee whether the update had been processed as a voluntary change. She hesitated and looked at Gregory. Gregory immediately stepped between Elijah and the screen. He said the internal coding was none of Elijah's concern and repeated that the crew was working to accommodate them. Elijah asked who had authorized the change. Gregory said Diane had made the adjustment and that he had approved it as terminal manager. Elijah asked whether either of them had documented the reason for separating a minor child from her only parent. Gregory's jaw tightened. He accused Elijah of trying to turn a routine seating change into a legal argument. Elijah did not respond to the insult. Instead, he asked the gate employee not to touch the record again. Gregory laughed and said Elijah had no authority to give instructions to airline personnel. At that moment, footsteps approached from the terminal side of the jet bridge. Thomas Reed, Meridian Atlantic Airlines Regional Executive Director, was walking toward the aircraft with 2 operations supervisors. He had been making an unannounced inspection of gate performance before the morning departures and had been told that one flight was being delayed by a seating dispute. Thomas expected to find an angry passenger or a confused employee. Then he saw Elijah standing beneath the harsh jet bridge, lighting with Zoe pressed against his side. Thomas slowed so abruptly that one of the supervisors nearly walked into him. For a second, he seemed unable to reconcile the plainly dressed man in the worn coat with the person he knew from private board meetings and annual strategy sessions. Then his eyes moved to Zoe, to Gregory's defensive posture, and to the open aircraft door. The color drained from his face. "Chairman Carter," Thomas said. Gregory turned toward him, irritated by the interruption, but the words reached to him before he could speak. His expression emptied. The gate employee froze with the device still in her hands. One of the operations supervisors straightened immediately. Thomas stepped forward and addressed Elijah with careful respect. He asked why the chairman of Meridian Atlantic Airlines was standing outside one of the company's aircraft instead of seated inside it. Gregory looked from Thomas to Elijah and then back again, as though waiting for someone to explain that he had misunderstood. Elijah did not answer the question directly. He gestured toward the gate device and asked Thomas whether a first-class passenger's assigned seat could be changed without consent, whether a minor could be separated from a parent without written approval, and whether a terminal manager could authorize the alteration without recording a legitimate operational reason. Thomas's eyes shifted toward Gregory. Gregory opened his mouth but produced no explanation. Elijah asked whether the original passenger data could still be recovered. Thomas said every change would have been time-stamped and attached to the employee account that made it. Elijah then asked whether the aircraft could legally depart while the passenger list contained an unauthorized modification. Thomas did not answer immediately. He already knew the implication. Gregory finally found his voice and attempted to step closer. He said the situation had been a misunderstanding caused by pressure to keep the flight on schedule. He insisted that Elijah and Zoe were about to be reseated and that there was no need to escalate the matter. Elijah looked at him without anger. "I am not asking for my seat back," he said. Gregory seemed confused. Elijah continued questioning the process. He asked whether Diane had verified Cassandra's assignment before moving him, whether Gregory had reviewed the reservation history before approving the change, and whether either of them had confirmed that the revised cabin record matched the people physically occupying the seats. Gregory admitted that he had relied on Diane's summary. Thomas looked toward the aircraft door, and the seriousness of the problem became visible in his expression. Elijah told him to lock the reservation data, immediately preserve every version of the passenger manifest, and prevent anyone from making further changes. He ordered the flight suspended until the entire record could be reviewed. He also instructed Thomas to contact Catherine Bishop, the airline's Director of Legal Affairs and Compliance, and bring her to the gate before any passenger was allowed to depart. Gregory stared at Elijah as though the request were an act of personal revenge. He reminded Thomas that a suspension would create delays, missed connections, and significant cost. Elijah answered that an unreliable passenger record was more serious than an inconvenient schedule. Thomas immediately took out his phone and began issuing instructions. One supervisor returned toward the terminal to notify operations control. The other moved to the gate desk and ordered the aircraft release status changed. Gregory stood motionless, listening as the flight he had tried to protect from delay was officially placed on hold. Inside the cabin, Diane received a call through the interphone. Her face tightened as she listened. She looked toward Cassandra, who was already impatiently checking her watch. Diane informed the captain that ground operations had suspended departure pending a passenger verification review. The announcement spread confusion through the cabin. Passengers who had watched Elijah being removed assumed the problem had ended. Now the aircraft door remained open. Ground personnel began gathering at the entrance, and no one could explain why the boarding system had suddenly been locked. Cassandra demanded to know how long the interruption would last. Diane said she had not been given a time. Cassandra accused the crew of incompetence and reminded Diane that important people had schedules that could not be disrupted by administrative mistakes. Diane tried to reassure her, but the confidence she had displayed while forcing Elijah from his seat was gone. She checked her tablet and discovered that she could no longer access the passenger list. Every attempt returned the same locked status. She looked toward Gregory through the open doorway, expecting him to restore control, but he would not meet her eyes. 5 minutes after Elijah had been forced out of seat 1A, the cabin announcement system activated. Passengers were informed that the aircraft could not continue boarding or prepare for departure until a mandatory ground review was completed. They were instructed to gather their personal belongings and leave the plane in an orderly manner. A wave of protest moved through first class and then through the rest of the cabin. Some passengers believed there was a mechanical failure, others whispered about a security threat. Several began recording again. Cassandra refused to stand. She told Diane that she would remain in her seat until someone explained why the entire aircraft was being emptied. Diane, now visibly shaken, repeated that everyone had to leave. Cassandra pointed toward Elijah's folded boarding pass, still lying partly beneath her hand, and complained that the delay had begun only after the troublesome passenger was removed. Diane did not answer. One by one, the passengers moved into the aisle and began filing toward the aircraft door. Cassandra eventually rose furious and humiliated by being treated like everyone else. She walked out ahead of Diane, followed by the assistant carrying her leather case. The moment she stepped onto the jet bridge, her expression changed. Elijah was no longer standing alone with his daughter. Thomas Reed stood beside him, speaking in a low and urgent tone. Catherine Bishop had arrived with members of the airline's legal and compliance teams. Additional senior airport managers were gathered nearby, waiting for instructions rather than giving them. Zoe still held her father's hand, but the people around Elijah now watched him with unmistakable deference. Gregory remained several feet away, pale and silent. As the passengers emerged from the aircraft, their complaints faded into confused murmurs. Those who had laughed at Elijah's worn clothes now studied the executives surrounding him. Diane stepped through the doorway last and saw Thomas turn toward Elijah before addressing him again as Chairman Carter. The words passed through the jet bridge like a sudden drop in pressure. Cassandra stopped in the middle of the walkway. Her eyes moved from Elijah's modest coat to Thomas, Catherine, and the assembled leadership team. For the first time since entering the aircraft, she had nothing to say. Gregory Hale moved toward Elijah before the last passengers had fully cleared the jet bridge. His face had lost all color, and the confidence he had shown inside the aircraft had disappeared. He lowered his voice, hoping the surrounding executives would not hear the desperation in it, and said the incident had been a serious misunderstanding. He insisted that he had never intended to disrespect Elijah or Zoe, and claimed he had acted only to prevent the flight from being delayed. Then, in his panic, he made the admission that exposed everything. "If I had known you were Chairman Carter, I would have handled this completely differently." Elijah looked at him for a long moment while Zoe remained beside him, still holding his hand. He did not raise his voice. "That is the problem, Gregory. You believe I deserved fair treatment only after you learned my title." Gregory tried to correct himself, but Elijah continued. He reminded him that the boarding passes had been valid before Thomas recognized him, that Zoe had been a child traveling with her father before anyone knew who he was, and that the rules protecting passengers had not suddenly become more important because the chairman was involved. Gregory said he had trusted Diane's explanation and believed the seat had to be reassigned for operational reasons. Elijah asked what operational reason required moving a paying passenger from seat 1A to an unassigned economy position while placing another passenger in the seat without reviewing her ticket. Gregory could not answer. He glanced toward Cassandra as if hoping she might defend him, but Cassandra stood with her arms folded, her expression shifting between anger and disbelief. Elijah turned to the gathered passengers and made it clear that the flight had not been stopped because his pride had been wounded. He said the aircraft had been suspended because the official passenger record had been altered without authorization. A seat assignment connected a person's identity to the location recorded for the flight. When that information was changed falsely, the company could no longer trust that the cabin record matched the people actually seated on board. The mistake was not a private insult that could be erased with an apology or a free ticket. It was a failure of procedure, accountability, and safety. Catherine Bishop stood at a portable operations terminal with 2 members of the compliance team, while Thomas Reed secured the area around the gate. She requested the original reservation file, the current manifest the employee access history and every modification made during boarding. Because Elijah had ordered the data locked quickly, the system preserved the sequence of changes. Catherine examined the information carefully before turning the screen so Thomas and Elijah could see it. The original reservation clearly showed Elijah Carter assigned to seat 1A and Zoe Carter assigned to seat 1B. Both tickets had been paid confirmed and checked at the gate without any warning or irregularity. Cassandra Whitmore's ticket showed a different first-class seat farther back in the cabin. There had been no duplicate booking and no system error. Catherine opened the modification record. Diane Fletcher's employee account had removed Elijah from seat 1A only minutes before departure. She had moved him into an unassigned economy status and transferred Cassandra into his original seat. Diane had then selected the code indicating that Elijah had voluntarily accepted the reassignment. No written consent, electronic signature, or recorded confirmation supported that claim. Catherine looked directly at Diane and asked when Elijah had agreed to the change. Diane swallowed and said she believed his decision to stand up and leave the seat had demonstrated acceptance. Catherine reminded her that Elijah had stood only after being threatened with removal by security. Compliance rules did not allow an employee to convert forced obedience into voluntary consent. Diane said she had been under pressure and was trying to keep the cabin calm. Catherine asked why she had ignored the boarding pass in Elijah's hand. Diane answered that Cassandra was a high-value passenger and had told her the front seat had been requested in advance. Catherine pointed to the ticket record showing that the request had never been approved. She then opened the authorization log. Gregory's manager account had approved Diane's change less than a minute after it was entered. There was no evidence that Gregory had reviewed Elijah's boarding pass, spoken privately with him, checked the reservation history, or investigated the effect of separating Zoe from her father. Gregory claimed Diane had described Elijah as disruptive and said he believed immediate action was necessary. Elijah asked whether standing quietly beside a legally purchased seat had become disruptive merely because the passenger refused to surrender it to someone wealthier. Gregory again had no answer. A young flight attendant named Tyler Brooks had been standing near the edge of the group, visibly uncertain whether to step forward. He had served in the cabin during boarding and had witnessed Diane's first review of the tickets. When Catherine asked whether any crew member had seen the seat map before the alteration, Tyler raised his hand. Diane turned sharply toward him, but Thomas told him to speak freely. Tyler took out his phone and explained that he had photographed the original seating chart because the cabin tablet briefly stopped responding during boarding. He had intended to use the image only to verify meal requests and passenger names if the system failed again. The photograph was time-stamped before Elijah was removed. It showed Elijah in 1A, Zoe in 1B, and Cassandra in her assigned seat. Tyler also showed a second image taken after Diane changed the record. The difference was undeniable. Catherine asked whether he had heard any discussion between Cassandra and Diane before the change. Tyler hesitated, then admitted that Cassandra had complained about her seat near the galley and told Diane that Whitmore Global would soon be selecting an airline for a major corporate travel agreement. Cassandra had suggested that employees who understood the needs of important clients were often remembered when executive recommendations were made. Diane looked down. Tyler said Diane's attitude toward Elijah changed immediately after that conversation. Before it, she had acknowledged that Elijah's boarding pass was valid. After it, she began describing the assignment as a system error. Cassandra stepped forward and accused Tyler of twisting a harmless remark. She said she had never directly ordered Diane to falsify a record and had only expected the level of service appropriate for someone bringing significant business to the airline. Catherine responded that the investigation would determine whether Cassandra's pressure contributed to the violation, but her status did not erase what had happened. Several passengers who had been watching from the gate area began speaking among themselves. One of them, the man who had recorded the confrontation from first class, approached Thomas and offered his video. Catherine reviewed it on his phone while the others gathered close enough to hear the audio. The recording showed Elijah seated calmly beside Zoe Cassandra standing over him, and Diane refusing to examine the evidence he offered. It captured Cassandra ridiculing Elijah's clothing, questioning whether someone like him belonged in first class, and demanding that the crew remove him. It also captured Zoe asking whether she and her father had done something wrong. The final portion showed Cassandra settling into 1A while Elijah's folded boarding pass remained beneath her hand. The passengers who had laughed or silently watched now avoided Elijah's eyes. Cassandra did not apologize. Instead, she accused Elijah of using his position to create a public spectacle and damage her reputation over a minor seating dispute. She reminded him that Whitmore Global was considering a corporate agreement worth millions to Meridian Atlantic Airlines. If he allowed her to be humiliated in front of the passengers, she warned that the agreement would disappear and the airline's board would hear exactly why. Elijah's expression did not change. He said a contract that depended on employees ignoring safety procedures and degrading ordinary passengers was not an opportunity the airline should accept. Cassandra told him he was being emotional because his daughter had witnessed the incident. Elijah answered that Zoe's presence made the failure more painful, but not more serious. The record would have been false whether the displaced passenger was the chairman, a mechanic, a teacher, or someone traveling for the first time. He refused to trade passenger dignity and procedural integrity for Whitmore Global's money. Catherine informed Cassandra that her premium customer privileges were being suspended while the airline reviewed her involvement in the incident. Cassandra attempted to walk back toward the gate, but airport security stepped into her path. Thomas told her she would not be allowed to reboard the aircraft or enter the restricted departure area. She demanded that Diane confirm she had never ordered an illegal change. Diane remained silent. Cassandra looked around at the passengers who had watched her take Elijah's seat and realized that no one was willing to defend her. Security escorted her away from the boarding area, while her assistant followed with the leather case. Her white suit and diamond jewelry no longer commanded admiration. They only made her easy to recognize as the woman from the recording spreading among the waiting passengers. Catherine then turned to Diane. She formally revoked Diane's authority to work the flight and ordered her employee access suspended pending a full investigation. Diane began to cry and said she had spent years building her career. Elijah did not respond with cruelty. He told her that experience made the decision worse, not better, because she had known the rules and ignored them to impress someone powerful. Diane handed over her tablet and identification badge before being escorted from the gate by a supervisor. Gregory remained nearby, hoping his apology and long service might protect him. Catherine continued reviewing the compliance archive and discovered that the morning's incident was not isolated. Several earlier complaints had accused terminal employees of favoring wealthy or publicly known passengers during seat disputes. Some involved families who had been separated passengers pressured into unwanted downgrades and complaints closed without proper review. Each file had passed through Gregory's office. In several cases, he had marked the reports resolved even though no interviews or supporting documents had been recorded. Gregory said the complaints had lacked evidence and that he had been trying to keep minor service issues from overwhelming the department. Catherine replied that he had not reduced the problems. He had hidden them. Thomas formally suspended Gregory from all terminal duties and ordered his system access disabled. Gregory looked at Elijah and asked for another chance to explain. Elijah said the investigation would give him that chance, but he would no longer control the records or the employees who might testify. Gregory surrendered his identification card. Around them, the balance of power had completely changed. Elijah remained in the same worn coat and scuffed shoes, but no one saw him as insignificant now. Cassandra had been removed. Diane had lost control of the cabin and Gregory had been stripped of authority. Yet Elijah showed no satisfaction. He looked down at Zoe, whose expression held relief mixed with sadness, and understood that exposing the truth was only the beginning. The company still had to prove that fairness would not disappear again the next time the passenger being mistreated had no title capable of frightening the people responsible. Of everyone at that gate, the one who changed the outcome was not the chairman. It was a young flight attendant who took a photograph of a screen because a tablet was acting strange and who raised his hand when raising it could have cost him his job. Most of us will never hold the authority to stop an aircraft, but nearly all of us at some point will hold one small piece of the truth in our hands. Keep it. Then be willing to say what you saw. Elijah stood before the displaced passengers in the gate lounge while Zoe remained quietly beside him, her hand resting inside his. He did not hide behind Thomas Reed Catherine Bishop or the authority of his position. Instead, he personally apologized for the delay and explained that every passenger had been required to leave the aircraft because the official manifest could no longer be trusted after unauthorized changes had been made. He made it clear that the inconvenience was real, that missed connections and disrupted plans mattered, and that the airline would not excuse its failure simply because the truth had eventually been discovered. Meridian Atlantic Airlines immediately provided meals access to the private waiting lounge replacement flights and appropriate compensation for every affected passenger. As the tension began to ease, several people who had watched Elijah's humiliation approached him. The man who had recorded the confrontation apologized for remaining silent while continuing to film. A woman who had laughed quietly admitted that she had judged Elijah by his worn coat before hearing a single fact. Others confessed that they had known something was wrong but had been afraid of creating trouble for themselves. Elijah accepted their apologies without bitterness, but he did not tell them that silence was harmless. He reminded them that cruelty often gained power not only from the person committing it, but also from the crowd that watched and decided not to interfere. Zoe listened closely, understanding that her father was not trying to shame anyone. He wanted them to remember the next person who might stand alone without a title money or influence. The internal investigation moved quickly because the records had been preserved. Gregory was dismissed for approving false passenger information, suppressing earlier complaints, and using his authority to favor people he considered important. Diane's employment was terminated because she had reassigned Elijah's seat without consent, falsely marked the change as voluntary, and risked separating a child from her parent. Tyler, however, was formally recognized for preserving the original seating evidence and for speaking truthfully when doing so could have damaged his career. Elijah recommended him for the airline's leadership training program, explaining that courage and integrity were more valuable than obedience without judgment. Before leaving the terminal, Elijah approved immediate reforms across Meridian Atlantic Airlines. No employee could remove a passenger from a confirmed seat merely to satisfy someone wealthy, famous, or commercially valuable. Any seating change involving a child required clear approval from the child's guardian. Complaints involving discrimination would be transferred to an independent department rather than handled by local managers who might benefit from hiding them. Employees were given the right to refuse instructions that violated procedure without fear of punishment, and senior executives would be required to travel anonymously at regular intervals so they could experience the service that ordinary passengers actually received. When the replacement aircraft was ready, Thomas arranged for Elijah and Zoe to receive seats 1A and 1B again. Before boarding, Elijah noticed a tired mother supporting a young son whose leg was injured. The boy struggled to move through the crowd and looked exhausted by the delay. Elijah quietly handed their first-class seats to them. Thomas offered to arrange another premium section, but Elijah declined. He and Zoe boarded with the remaining passengers and chose 2 ordinary seats farther back in the cabin. Once they were settled, Zoe asked why he had given away the seats after fighting so hard to prove they were theirs. Elijah explained that he had never fought for the comfort of a chair. He had fought because the rules had been broken and because people had been treated as though dignity depended on wealth. Justice did not mean taking back everything that had been stolen from them. It meant making certain the same thing could not be done to someone else. Zoe looked toward the front of the aircraft, where the injured boy was now resting beside his mother, then leaned against Elijah's shoulder. As the plane lifted toward Denver, the events of the morning no longer felt like a story about a powerful chairman revealing himself. They became a lesson about the kind of power that truly mattered. Real authority, was not the ability to remove someone from a seat, silence an employee, or demand obedience. It was the responsibility to stand beside those who could not protect themselves and to change the system so they would never have to stand alone. And perhaps the simplest thing to carry from that morning is this: look at the person in front of you before you look at their coat, their shoes, or their name. Speak up while it is still inconvenient, rather than after it becomes safe. And when the wrong is finally corrected, do not measure your victory by what you got back, but by what can no longer happen to the next person standing where you once stood.